Thank you, Sebastian, and thank you, Marlene, and the Central Asia Programme for inviting me to give this presentation today. And thank you all for coming out in what is a wet and windy day in DC. Unfortunately, the topic of today's conversation is perhaps as miserable as the weather, but I'll try and give my kind of insights into this topic. So Sadruddin Jurayev was born in 1985 in the village of Navgilem, near the city of Isfara in northern Tajikistan. Between 2002 and 2005, he studied in the local mosque. He studied the Quran with a local mullah and member of the Islamic Renaissance Party called Saidullah Marupov. On May 3rd, 2006, the police arrested Marupov and started rounding up his supporters. Jurayev fled the country, fearing for his safety, and left for Russia in June 2006. He worked in Moscow on a building site for a while, until in November 2006, the Prosecutor General's Office of Tajikistan brought formal charges against him. Now, they accused him of two things. The first was that he had participated in an attack on 3 members of the Sugd regional parliament in September 2006, when he was living in Moscow. The second was that he was a member of the IMU back in 1992, when he was 7 years old. So they issued these charges against him, and issued an international arrest warrant for his detention. And he was okay until November 2009, when the Russian police, acting on this arrest warrant, detained him, and he was in pre-trial detention until September 2011, when he was released because he successfully was granted temporary asylum from the Federal Migration Service. So he thought he was okay. But on the evening of the 31st of October 2011, he was driving with a friend near Moscow State University when a minivan blocked their path. 4 Tajik-speaking men got out of the minivan and bundled Sadruddin into the back of the van. They beat him and tortured him for a day, and he was forced into another car with the Russian government number plates, brought to Domodedovo International Airport, and put on a plane without going through any of the customs or border formalities, and flown back to Tajikistan. In November 2011, Jurayev stood trial with 33 others and was sentenced to 26 years in prison. His case came to light because he successfully lodged a complaint in the European Court of Human Rights, to which Russia is a signatory, but unfortunately for Sadruddin it was too late. Jurayev's case is not an isolated incident. Since 2002, there have been at least 51 cases of the Tajik security services operating extraterritorially. Now, by extraterritorially, I refer to activities undertaken by agents from a state outside the territory or jurisdiction of their home state, and within the territory of another sovereign state. So, activities including kidnapping, assassination, physical attack, intimidation, and surveillance. And so this is really what I'm going to be talking about today. Now, the 51 cases are all based on public sources, publicly available sources, collected from the European Court of Human Rights, various human rights organizations, and the media. But I really feel this is the tip of the iceberg. So in September 2016, the official, Ramazan Rahimzoda, who is the Ministry of Internal Affairs in Tajikistan, said that in 2015, 150 extremists had been returned to the country, including 133 members of Islamic State, and with 75 of them returning voluntarily. So that was just in 2015, according to the official figures. And there are still Interpol red notices, or notices for arrest, in place for 1,661 individuals, including 1,400 who are accused of terrorism. So these are mostly people who are accused of being extremists, some of whom are linked to the Islamic State or other terrorist organizations, others who are linked to other outlawed opposition movements such as Group 24 and the Islamic Renaissance Party. So this is the kind of topic of conversation today. What I'm going to be talking about is based on my the fieldwork of my PhD between 2010 and 2013 in Tajikistan, and 2014 and 2015 in Moscow. I just wanted to flag up some kind of other publications, other things that have been coming out in the last few months, really, and are going to come out in the next few months on this topic. So the first is the Central Asian Political Exiles Database, which was compiled by John Heathershaw at the University of Exeter, along with some of his research assistants, and linked with Alex Cooley at the Harriman Institute, where I am. And the database went live, I think, a week or 2 weeks ago, and it contains over 160 exiles, including most of the people I'll be kind of talking about today from Tajikistan. Now, the database is, most of the entries are from Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, but also entries from other countries in Central Asia. The other publication that is kind of pertinent to what I'll be talking about today is a report which was published 2 weeks ago as well by the Foreign Policy Centre, which is a think tank in London, and it's entitled No Shelter, and it really focuses on kind of these extraterritorial security instances, and there are chapters on Tajikistan, the rest of Central Asia, Russia, as well as some other Caucasian countries. So it's really a report by academics as well as kind of activists, and including some people who've been victims of some of these practices themselves. And the third, so I was kind of closely involved with the first two. The last one I've been involved, but I'm obviously not an author, and that's a new book that's coming out from Yale University Press in scheduled for February if it gets approved by the lawyers, which I hope has happened now. They had a lot of problems, but that's by Alexander Cooley and John Heathershaw from the University of Exeter, and it's entitled Dictators Without Borders. And the book has a whole chapter on security, although it mostly looks at kind of the political economy side of the kind of offshore relations of the rulers of Central Asia, but there is a chapter again there on security. So I just thought I'd flag up those things as kind of things that are linked to what I'm talking about today. So basically I'll be talking a little bit about kind of outlining some of the types of practices I'm talking about, outlining kind of who's been targeted as part of this kind of extraterritorial security governance, looking at the kind of geographical spread of some of these instances, and then bringing it on to kind of look at ways that, based on kind of an ethnography that I've done with some of these individuals who've been targeted, looking at ways people have managed to cope with being a target, looking at ways that people have successfully resisted being returned to Tajikistan. And then at the end I'll give some kind of brief thoughts on what these kind of extraterritorial security instances, what kind of implications they have for our understanding of Tajikistan as a state, the politics and security of Tajikistan, and kind of maybe Central Asia more broadly. So we're looking really at a range of instances, and I think there are a number of stages to the kind of typical case that we see. The first is obviously the individual having an arrest warrant issued against them, formal charges brought from the Prosecutor General's office in Tajikistan, and then distributed. Now sometimes this is distributed through Interpol in the form of red notices, and other times it's issued through other kind of regional cooperation mechanisms such as the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. But the first stage is obviously someone goes on one of these lists. And this is generally followed by detention, often when people have tried to cross borders, enter at airports, or trying to cross between land borders. People have been detained. Other times they've obviously been stopped for a routine document check if they're migrants living in Russia, and then they've suddenly been brought into the police office and put through some kind of database and then detained as a result. A number of kind of things can happen around this time, or even before they're detained, including an important mechanism by which Tajikistan has tried to kind of more informal mechanism by which they've tried to force people to return has been the intimidation of relatives, the intimidation of individuals, perhaps before they've been detained. So there's a case in Istanbul last year of a former Radio Free Europe journalist called Norat Afshan, who received a number of threatening phone calls, was followed around by a Tajik-speaking man followed her to when she picked up her child from school in Istanbul and various other kind of things. So some kind of informal kind of intimidation. Also, most of these activists who are living outside the country have family members back at home, so there have been a number of cases of intimidation against those family members as a means to kind of force people to come home, and there have been 3 cases out of the 51 where people have voluntarily returned, after threats were made against their family members. And we saw this in September 2016 when Group 24 and the Islamic Renaissance Party held a kind of walk-in silent protest at at an OSCE conference on human rights in Warsaw, and as a result, Ilhom John Jakub Zoda, who is a leader of the IRPT from the north of the country, his family was kind of attacked by a group of individuals, and I saw last week that the GKMB, the security services, have actually locked up his house, so his family can no longer live in their house, and they put a seal across the door because of his political activities outside of the country. Shabnam Khudododoyeva, who was a member of Group 24 who was detained in Belarus, her daughter has been kind of physically assaulted. I think her daughter's only 7 or 8 years old, by individuals in Tajikistan. So one way that kind of the government has tried to make people return is through this kind of intimidation. People have also been attacked whilst living in exile. Bakhtiyor Sartori, who is a kind of academic and a kind of with links to the opposition, was attacked in Moscow. Dodrujan Atavalo, who was a journalist and head of Vatan Do, another opposition movement, was attacked in Moscow as well. So a number of these kind of practices. So if people have actually, after going on notice and being detained, the kind of final stage is rendition, the forcible transfer of individuals across state borders. Now most of the cases, in the database, in the kind of list of cases that I have, most of the successful cases of rendition are extraordinary rendition. They bypass the formal legal mechanisms. They're not formal cases of legal extradition. And I think there are 18 cases, at least through these public sources, although I think the figure is a lot higher, of Tajikistan, or the agents from the Tajik state successfully kidnapping people and putting them on planes and bringing them home. So Jurayev, the man I talked about in the kind of opening comments, is only one example of this. And finally, you have cases or a case of assassination. The leader of Group 24, Umar Ali Kuvatov, who left Tajikistan in 2012 and kind of was chased or had to move around to various different countries, Dubai, Istanbul, Moscow, Dubai, Istanbul, until he was eventually assassinated in March 2015, would be the kind of prime example of this. So you kind of have this kind of typology of kind of from the more everyday kind of level of intimidation through to examples of kidnapping and assassination. So who has the government been targeting? I think as part of the Central Asian Political Exiles database, I think John Heathershaw identified kind of 6 different kind of target groups. So first, there are people who've been accused of links to terrorist organizations such as the Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan and increasingly in recent years Islamic State. So you've had numerous cases of agents from Tajik security services going to Turkey, for example, and bringing people back who were intending to cross the border into Syria, and often publicly declaring this. They openly admit that they went into Turkish sovereign territory to do this. The second kind of group of people is revolutionary Islamic groups, now groups like Hizb ut-Tahrir, who have links to violence, although they officially say that they do not condone violent acts, and they want to, a revolutionary takeover of the Tajik state or various states to replace them with a kind of larger caliphate or Islamic state. So a number of people who spoke Tahrir have been targeted outside of Tajikistan. The third group is the kind of more accommodational Islamic groups, such as the Islamic Renaissance Party, who, although they are in opposition to the government, they repeatedly declared their allegiance to having a secular state and pushed for an Islamization of society, but not a revolutionary takeover of society. And the fourth group is the kind of secular opposition groups, such as Group 24, an opposition group formed by a former insider, Umar Ali Kubatov, in 2012, released a number of documents about kind of compromat, so linking the government, linking Rahman to various and allies to the regime to various corrupt practices. Vatan Dor, which is kind of another organization led by a journalist, and so these are kind of groups that oppose the regime, but are firmly kind of secular in their outlook. The fifth group, is kind of former regime insiders, people who were either within the government itself. Sometimes they were linked to the Popular Front during the Civil War. Other people who were linked to the United Tajik Opposition for the current government during that Civil War. But people who were kind of had held official positions within the regime. And the last group is kind of journalists and human rights activists who've left the country as a result of kind of pressure at home. And I'll talk a little bit about how those kind of things have been changing over time. But as this map shows, the vast majority of cases, right here somewhere, how many is it? It's I think 37 cases. 37 cases out of the 51 have taken place in Russia, where over 1 million Tajik migrants live. So it's kind of the primary base of both Tajik labor migrants, but also the diaspora traditionally was Russia. But there's also kind of another base, which is, or center of kind of diasporic politics, which is Turkey, Istanbul. Specifically, and there have been, I think, 7 cases out of the 51 have taken place in Turkey. Another place, Ukraine, I think there have been 3 or 4 cases taking place there, and then, as you can see, cases in Kazakhstan, United Arab Emirates, Kyrgyzstan, Moldova, Belarus. I label that one as Lithuania by accident, but I think it's Finland and Spain. So really it has kind of, geographically there's quite a large spread of these kind of cases of extraterritorial security governments. Though primarily the countries we're talking about, and the only countries where they've had any success, and I'll talk about this later, is Russia and Turkey. So although people have been detained and people have been stopped in places like Ukraine and United Arab Emirates and Spain, no one's been sent back from those countries. So this graph kind of shows the incidences over time. So the first incidence that I found is in 2002, going all the way through, I don't know if people can see through my head, but all the way through to 2016, obviously this year. And you see a real spike in 2014 to 2015, which is when the Group 24, October 2014, Group 24 was declared an extremist organization and outlawed after the leader called for protests in Dushanbe, and obviously September last year, the Islamic Renaissance Party was also labeled a terrorist organization. So this was when we really saw a vast increase. So before 2010, for example, there were only 9 instances, but post 2014 there have been 33 instances. So as you can see from the graphic, it's been a real increase and a trend towards increased occurrences of these kind of extraterritorial measures. And I think it's also, there's been a kind of trend away from regime insiders. So a number of the earliest targets were people like Yakub Salimov, who was the former interior minister, who was extradited from Moscow in 2003, Makram Duruzi Iskandarov, who was opposition leader of the Democratic Party, who was extradited from Moscow as well in 2005, and former Deputy Prime Minister Abdullah Jonov, who now resides in the United States, was stopped in Kiev in 2013. So a number of these earlier instances were regime insiders, but as we've seen the regime instances against regime insiders fall, we've seen increased practices against or occurrences against Group 24 and the Islamic Renaissance Party, and third, Islamic State, people who are accused of attempting to travel to Syria and Iraq. Now, of all of these cases, Tajikistan has had, the Tajik government has had some success in returning people. It's targeted 49 people. 2 of the people in the 51 were never detained and never had formal arrest warrants issued against them. But it's successfully, the government has successfully brought back 18 people, according to my kind of publicly available statistics. So it's had some success, but a lot of people have managed to successfully resist being arrested. So I think the first thing people can do is avoid being arrested in the first place. And I think there are a number of ways that these kind of exiles living in, I guess I can talk most authoritatively about Russia, because that's where I kind of spent time with some of these individuals. But there are a number of kind of strategies and tactics they can adopt to manage to avoid being arrested, avoid being targeted. So after Mahmoud Ibrahimov, who is a leader of the Youth for the Revival of Tajikistan, he was a former businessman who left the country and tried to kind of set up this opposition movement in 2014, traveling around the country, and he was eventually kidnapped. Well, first he was attacked, and then he managed to escape, and then a few months later he was kidnapped and taken in a plane back to Tajikistan and sentenced to over 20 years in prison. Shortly after this incident, I met with one of his friends, and he said to me, you know, Ibrahimov was naive. He was not a good politician or player of the political game. He did not understand the risk he was taking. So, you know, according to my friend, Ibrahimov was, you know, a man of principle, and he genuinely wanted to see a change in Tajik society, but he didn't really have the necessary skills to negotiate the dangers of Tajik politics. He didn't really know, from my friend's account, he didn't really know the kind of dangerous situation he was getting himself into, and didn't adopt the correct strategies to prevent himself being targeted. So I think, I think there are 3 main kind of groupings of strategies people can adopt. So the first is kind of concealment. So this includes kind of changing one's physical appearance, setting up shadow email accounts, which is something that many people I knew were doing, you know, making fake email accounts with fake names and never referring to themselves in their own name in those, using those email accounts. Something that I think Marintha Miles and Abdulfatah Shafiev found in their piece in Democratization about these kind of internet groups is that people increasingly on the social networks have been making groups private, you know, groups that were formerly on Facebook or on Odnoklassniki that were publicly available are now become private. So a lot of these kind of ways that the opposition activists who are operating outside of the borders of the country are realizing that they're in a dangerous situation, and that they're adopting these ways to conceal their identity in some way, to prevent themselves being targeted. Another kind of category of avoiding or coping, I guess, with being a target is the idea of avoidance. So people I knew who were members of the Islamic Renaissance Party, for example, who knew they were potentially being targeted, wouldn't travel beyond Russia at that time. They wouldn't even go on the subway. They would avoid public places where they could potentially be stopped by the police. They would stick together in groups, and they would avoid these kind of situations where they could be detained for benign reasons and get themselves in trouble. Another kind of more common kind of thing that many both opposition activists and journalists and human rights activists have done is kind of this kind of self-censorship, knowing the boundaries of what they can say and what they cannot say, and not saying things publicly that they were perhaps saying in private. So self-censorship is another kind of example of avoidance. The final kind of category is kind of protection. So a number of people I knew in Moscow were kind of cultivating ties with local police. One person I knew who was a member of the Islamic Renaissance Party, hired a bodyguard / driver to kind of keep him safe. So other people also kind of cultivating ties and kind of establishing a klicha, or kind of protection from, with numerous links to kind of like protection rackets in Moscow. Number of Tajik dominated or Tajik protection rackets now kind of protecting the opposition from any kind of negative things. I guess the kind of fourth thing is obviously exit, and a number of people, because countries like Russia and Turkey are no longer considered safe. You've had a massive increase in the number of people attempting to get to the European Union. For example, Poland has become the kind of the go-to place because it has the nearest kind of border to the former Soviet Union, although it is obviously an EU state. So there's been a massive increase in the number of people trying to leave Russia and the former Soviet Union and Turkey because they're no longer perceived to be safe. I think it's difficult to say why have there been more successes in Russia and Turkey. On the one hand, the Tajik security services have closer ties, certainly with the Russian security services than they do with security services outside of the former Soviet Union. Obviously, these are places where there have been greater numbers of diaspora groups have formed and more people are living, on the other hand. And I think kind of third, Turkey, Russia, and Tajikistan have a kind of shared authoritarian culture where it's more acceptable to label individuals as extremists and terrorists, and there's less of a recourse to human rights legislation or the need to grant someone a free trial or prevent torture. So, as I said, so these are the kind of main ways that people can avoid being arrested. But once they have been arrested, people have managed to successfully resist being sent back to Tajikistan. So in Russia, the primary way has been through the European Court of Human Rights, which Russia signed in 1999, I think. Though I think it may, this avenue for Tajik opposition members is closing, I think. So 13 citizens of Tajikistan have lodged complaints, formal complaints through the European Court of Human Rights. 7 of them whilst they were detained in Russia before they went home. 6 of them after the fact. So these 7 people have managed to successfully use the convention, the founding convention of the European Court of Human Rights, to successfully prevent themselves being sent home. So the most relevant article is Article 3, which states that no one shall be subjected to torture or inhumane or degrading treatment or punishment. And they've used arguments that these kind of practices take place in Tajikistan, where torture is practiced in the justice system, and they can justifiably argue that if they return to Tajikistan, they wouldn't be granted a free trial, and that many of their charges are politically motivated. So they managed to use this to prevent themselves being sent home. Others have used Article 5.1, which is the right to liberty and security, and others have also used Article 5.4, which is the right to lawfulness of detention, because these are the people who've been detained in Russia for too long in pre-trial detention, and they managed to secure their release. Those outside of the European Court of Human Rights area have managed to also argue against Interpol red notices. So there was a case last year of Suleiman Davlatov, who was a Group 24 member who was accused of being an ISIS recruiter as well, and detained in Finland when he crossed the border from Russia. He was a long-term resident of St. Petersburg, and he had a red notice issued against him, an arrest warrant from Interpol, but he managed to successfully secure asylum in Lithuania, and according to the new protocols of Interpol, managed to get himself removed from the red notice list. Because if you have a red notice issue against you, even though Tajikistan has not been successful in extraditing political opponents through Interpol, regardless, having an Interpol red notice against you is very disruptive to your everyday life. It prevents you from traveling, it prevents you from opening a bank account, it prevents you from being able to find work. So a number of these people, the use of red notice by the Tajik government, although it's not, I don't think the Tajik government expects it to be successful in rendering people back from Europe, for example, Western Europe. Nonetheless, it has a real impact on people's lives, and also, by using this international mechanism, the government can try and kind of increase the legitimacy of the claims it makes against the Islamic Renaissance Party and Group 24, i.e. that they are terrorists and extremists. So, coming to the kind of implications of this. So what do, these extraterritorial security practices, these security practices that are happening beyond Tajikistan but targeting Tajik citizens, what do they say about the political situation in Tajikistan? What do they more theoretically tell us about kind of the nature of the Tajik state and the nature of security in Tajikistan? So obviously there is a human rights issue here, and much of the work that's been done so far documenting these cases has been from Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, the Norwegian Helsinki Committee, who have rightfully said that if these people are returned home, they will not get a free trial. They will be subjected, or likely to be subjected to torture, and their trials, of course, as we've seen from the politically motivated trials against the Islamic Renaissance Party, these trials will happen behind closed doors. There'll be no transparency in the protest, in the process. So yeah, so certainly there is an issue that these people, although some of them may be guilty of a crime, they certainly haven't been, even though they've been detained in Russia, for example, they haven't been accused, they haven't been tried of any crime at that point, and justifiably their human rights are at risk if they return to the country. And clearly, as I've kind of alluded to, there is an impact. These practices have an impact on the daily lives of those who are targeted, who live in fear, who have to adopt these different strategies to cope with life as an exile, life as a potential target of the government. But beyond this, I think there are kind of 5 broader points that I think these kind of cases indicate about Tajikistan. So often Western analysts, or analysts within the region as well, think of Tajikistan as a kind of backwater, isolated from the transnational flow of goods, ideas, and labor. Tajikistan is seen as a kind of unaffected by globalization, or at least less affected by globalization. And I think these cases tell us that we need to pay more attention to the kind of offshore spaces of Tajik politics. So a lot of these political struggles that have their roots in Tajikistan are now taking place beyond Tajikistan. So over 1 million people from the country obviously live in Russia. The internet is being increasingly used by the country, and that's becoming a space where people are contesting the politics of the country. People are agitating against the regime, discussing important issues. And Tauco, for example, the largest industrial enterprise in the country, is owned by a shell company based in the British Virgin Islands. The legal struggle over the ownership of the smelter came to the High Court in London and ended up being the most costly in British history at the time. So, these cases really indicate that Tajikistan, the state, has become transnationalized. It is linked with these kind of processes of globalization. The struggles that are taking place do have these kind of offshore elements, and I think we've seen an increased. Analysts have started paying closer attention to this, but need for more research into some of these aspects. More generally, from the perspective of kind of security studies and international relations, I think there's been a lack of studies of, although there have been lots of studies of immigration, so people coming into the country and how they're presented as a security threat and the measures taken against them, there's been far fewer studies looking at emigration. How do authoritarian countries view people who leave the country? There have been studies that have looked at, for example, how the Armenians Armenia tries to use its diaspora to pursue its kind of conflict with Azerbaijan, and there have been studies of kind of how countries with large migrant populations try and get the diaspora to donate and give remittances back to the country because that's an essential part of the economy. But there haven't been so many studies of, what are these how are political exiles viewed? How are emigrants who've left the country viewed as a security threat, a potential security threat to the home country? So I think that's really somewhere where we can do a bit more thinking, a bit more research. The second kind of point I want to make, third point in fact, is about kind of rethinking state weakness. So Tajikistan is often kind of portrayed as the weakest state in Central Asia, the weakest state in the former Soviet Union, and in some respects that is true. The country is portrayed often by analysts as the government is unable to control its own territory, unable to control its own borders, and doesn't kind of have sovereignty over all of its territory. But at the same time, I think these instances I've looked at today kind of indicate that there, although there are weaknesses, the state displays weaknesses, it still has the ability to, it has developed a relatively sophisticated extraterritorial security governance regime that has spread, as we showed from the map, into numerous jurisdictions. So I think, although the state displays weaknesses, I think regardless of these weaknesses, it has been able to deploy its security services in various jurisdictions. The fourth point is that Tajikistan is often reduced to a pawn in the games of great powers. As part of the new great game, the Tajik government is a pawn in the hands of China, Russia, the US, and other external players, and it doesn't really have any agency in these relationships. But I think that these examples that I've talked about today shows that to some degree it does have agency, and it's not all one-way traffic. So the Tajik government has been able to deploy its security services outside of the country, sometimes openly with the collaboration from local intelligence services, but also in other cases it's managed to go in there, get its citizens out, and then return without any, at least formally, publicly, without any kind of protest from those host governments. So I think we need to kind of rethink Tajikistan as a pawn of global players and see it as a player in these games itself. Interpol is another example of this. It's an international system, that's supposed to facilitate cooperation and communication between police services, but nonetheless it's been appropriated by states like Tajikistan to pursue opponents, to make their lives difficult, to lend some degree of legitimacy to their campaign against the opposition. It's another example of how one of these international organizations has been kind of manipulated by what is seen as a weak regime, that of Tajikistan. The kind of final kind of point is again a more kind of theoretical point. And that's kind of how do these extraterritorial instances affect our understanding of the state? So, the Weberian understanding of the state as a monopoly of violence within a delimited territory. If that is the case, how do these instances where the Tajik government has gone into the sovereign territory of another state affect our understanding of states? So, I think in the Tajik case, and this is something that I'm interested to discuss, we've had it's not a kind of ebbing away of, or a loss of sovereignty. I think it's a reformulation of sovereignty around the concept of population rather than territory. So I think, the Tajik state, although it does have, a fixed territory, for the government almost, people who've left the country, if they maintain their citizenship, then they still remain part of the state and subject to its rules and subject to its laws, at least to a degree. So this kind of idea of the Tajik people, even if they live overseas, are still linked to the home state. But I'd be interested to discuss that in questions. I think that's